The year is 1977, and New York City pulses with a rhythm that never stops. Neon lights slice through the darkness of Manhattan's streets like electric veins, painting the night in shades of pink, blue, and gold. The city breathes to the 4/4 beat of disco, where Saturday Night Fever isn't just a movie, it's a way of life. In this glittering world of mirror balls and cocaine dreams, where John Travolta moves define a generation, and the Bee Gees soundtrack plays the anthem of excess, stands the most legendary nightclub in the world. The Denmark. Rising 12 stories into the Manhattan skyline, the Denmark isn't just a nightclub, it's an empire of hedonism, a palace of pleasure where the beautiful people come to lose themselves in music that makes their souls shake. The building's facade gleams with chrome and glass, its entrance marked by velvet ropes that separate the chosen from the desperate. Above the door, in letters that blaze with white-hot intensity, the name Denmark burns against the night like a beacon calling to every dreamer, every dancer, every soul hungry for something more than the mundane world beyond these walls. Inside, the main floor stretches like a cathedral of sound and light. The dance floor, polished to mirror perfection, reflects the kaleidoscope of colors that pulse from above. Suspended overhead, the largest mirror ball in New York casts diamond fragments of light across hundreds of gyrating bodies. The DJ booth, elevated like a throne, commands the space with decks that spin vinyl records worth more than most people's cars. The sound system, custom-built and worth a small fortune, pumps bass so deep it vibrates through the bones of dancers and rattles the windows of buildings 3 blocks away. This kingdom of night was built by a man whose very presence could transform any gathering into a celebration. Hamlet Denmark Sr. possessed that rare magnetism that made ordinary people feel extraordinary simply by being in his orbit. Tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair that caught the light like spun metal and eyes that seemed to hold secrets of every party ever thrown. He was more than a nightclub owner, he was the high priest of New York nightlife. Hamlet Sr. understood something fundamental about human nature. People didn't just want to dance, they wanted to transform. They wanted to shed their daytime selves, the accountants and secretaries, the lawyers and shop clerks, and become creatures of pure rhythm and desire. The Denmark offered that transformation. From the moment patrons passed through those velvet ropes, they entered a world where social barriers dissolved like sugar in champagne, where a Wall Street executive might find himself grinding against a Puerto Rican seamstress from the Bronx, both of them lost in the hypnotic pulse of "Love to Love You Baby." But the Denmark was more than just a dance floor. The building housed multiple levels of carefully orchestrated experiences. The second floor featured the Crystal Room, an intimate space with low lighting and curved banquettes where deals were made and secrets were whispered over $1,000 bottles of champagne. The third floor held the Paradise Lounge, where the city's elite gathered for private parties that often lasted until the next evening. Higher still were the offices where the real business of the club took place. The careful cultivation of influence, the delicate balance of keeping the right people happy while keeping the wrong people out. Hamlet Sr.'s office occupied the entire top floor, a penthouse that looked out over the city he had conquered one night at a time. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan's glittering grid, while inside, the decor mixed luxury with the theatrical flair that defined the disco era. White leather furniture, chrome fixtures, and a bar that could serve 50 people without breaking a sweat. The walls were covered with photographs of every celebrity, politician, and cultural icon who had passed through the Denmark's doors, and they all had. The man himself moved through this empire with the fluid grace of a dancer and the sharp awareness of a general. He knew every employee by name, from the coat check girls to the security guards who looked like they could bench press small cars. He remembered the birthdays of regular customers, the drink preferences of VIPs, and the personal struggles of staff members who thought no one noticed. This attention to detail, this genuine care for the people who made his world possible, was what transformed the Denmark from just another nightclub into something approaching a religion. Every evening, as the sun set over the Hudson River and the city began its transformation from business to pleasure, Hamlet Sr. would conduct his ritual tour of the club. Dressed in suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent but wearing them with an ease that made the expense invisible, he would walk through each level, checking details that others might consider trivial but that he knew made the difference between a good night and a legendary one. He would adjust the angle of a spotlight, taste test the cocktail mixers, and listened to the sound system with ears that could detect the slightest imperfection in the mix. He knew that perfection was not an achievement but a practice, something that had to be renewed every single night. The Denmark's reputation wasn't built on past glories but on the promise that tonight, whoever walked through those doors would experience something they had never experienced before. The staff watched him with a mixture of awe and genuine affection. In an industry notorious for exploitation and casual cruelty, Hamlet Sr. treated his employees like family. He paid better than any other club in the city, offered health insurance when such benefits were rare in the nightlife world, and had a policy of promoting from within that meant a busboy today might be managing a floor next year. But more than the money or the benefits, it was his presence that inspired such loyalty. When he walked into a room, conversations didn't stop, they intensified. People stood straighter, smiled brighter, moved with more purpose. He had the gift of making everyone around him feel like they were part of something important, something that mattered in ways that extended far beyond the boundaries of nightclub entertainment. In this glittering kingdom of night, Hamlet Sr. ruled alongside a queen whose beauty and grace had become legend in their own right. Gertrude Denmark moved through the Denmark like a goddess descended from Mount Olympus to dance among mortals. Her honey blonde hair, perfectly feathered in the style that defined the decade, caught the light from 1,000 mirror balls and seemed to glow with its own internal radiance. She wore flowing gowns that shimmered with sequins and moved like liquid gold across the dance floor, each step a study in elegance that made grown men forget their own names. But Gertrude was far more than a beautiful accessory to her husband's empire. She possessed a sharp intelligence that complemented Hamlet Sr.'s vision, and together they had transformed the Denmark from a simple nightclub into a cultural phenomenon. While he managed the business and cultivated the atmosphere, she handled the social architecture that made their club the center of New York's cultural universe. Gertrude had an intuitive understanding of people that bordered on the supernatural. She could spot a troublemaker from across the crowded dance floor, identify a celebrity trying to blend in with the regular crowd, and sense the exact moment when a party was about to transform from good to legendary. She moved through the club each night like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, making introductions that would spark friendships, business deals, and love affairs that would echo through the gossip columns for months. Her office, adjacent to her husband's penthouse suite, reflected her sophisticated taste and practical nature. The walls were covered in deep burgundy velvet, and the furniture consisted of pieces that managed to be both luxurious and comfortable. Unlike the public areas of the club, which pulsed with energy and movement, Gertrude's private space was an oasis of calm, where she could retreat from the constant stimulation of the nightlife world. It was here that she would meet with the fashion designers who wanted to showcase their latest creations on the Denmark's dance floor, the photographers who sought permission to capture the club's legendary atmosphere, and the journalists who understood that an interview with Gertrude Denmark was worth more than a front-page story. She had become the unofficial ambassador of disco culture, the woman whose approval could launch careers and whose disapproval could end them. The relationship between Hamlet Sr. and Gertrude had become the stuff of legend among New York's nightlife elite. They had met in 1968, when she was a young model working the fashion shoots during the day and haunting the underground clubs at night. He was already building his reputation as a promoter who could turn any space into a party that people would talk about for years. Their courtship unfolded across the dance floors of Manhattan, a romance written in shared glances over crowded rooms and whispered conversations in the early morning hours when the music finally stopped. Their wedding, held at the Denmark itself in 1971, had been the social event of the decade. The guest list read like a who's who of entertainment, politics, and high society. The ceremony took place on the main dance floor, transformed for the occasion with thousands of white orchids and enough candles to illuminate a small city. The reception flowed through all 12 floors of the building, with different musical acts performing on each level, from jazz quartets in the intimate lounges to full disco orchestras on the main floor. Their marriage had produced one child, a son they named Hamlet Jr., though everyone who knew the family called him Harry. The boy had inherited his father's magnetic presence and his mother's sharp intelligence, growing up in the unique environment of New York's most famous nightclub. While other children played with toys, Harry learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of adult gatherings. By the age of 10, He could identify every important person who walked through the Denmark's doors and understood the subtle signs that indicated whether a party was succeeding or failing. But as Harry approached his 20th birthday in 1977, he had begun to chafe against the expectations that came with being the heir to the Denmark Empire. He had spent the past 2 years studying at Columbia University, majoring in philosophy and literature, drawn to questions about meaning and authenticity that seemed at odds with the world of his parents. While he loved his family and understood the significance of what they had built, he struggled with the idea that his entire future had been predetermined by his birthright. This tension between Harry and his inheritance had become a source of gentle concern for both Hamlet Sr. and Gertrude. They could see their son's intelligence and potential, but they also sensed his restlessness, his desire to forge his own path, rather than simply stepping into the role that awaited him. They had raised him to think independently, and now they were discovering that independent thinking sometimes led to unexpected conclusions. The Denmark continued to thrive under their joint leadership, but by the spring of 1977, subtle changes were becoming apparent to those who knew how to look. The disco scene that had seemed so revolutionary just a few years earlier was beginning to show signs of commercialization that threatened its authentic spirit. Corporate interests were moving into the nightclub business, bringing with them a calculating coldness that was antithetical to the organic magic that places like the Denmark had cultivated. Hamlet Sr. had begun to express concerns about these changes to his closest advisors, including his younger brother Claudius, who had recently returned to New York after several years managing entertainment venues in Las Vegas. Claudius Denmark shared his older brother's business acumen, but possessed a harder edge, a willingness to embrace the commercial possibilities that Hamlet Sr. viewed with suspicion. The two brothers had always been different in temperament and approach. Where Hamlet Sr. was intuitive and relationship-focused, Claudius was analytical and profit-driven. Where the older brother saw the Denmark as a cultural institution that happened to make money, the younger brother saw it as a business that happened to create culture. These philosophical differences had remained largely theoretical during Claudius's absence, but his return to New York was beginning to highlight the fundamental disagreements between their visions for the future. As spring turned to summer in 1977, the disco scene reached a fever pitch of popularity and excess. The Denmark remained at the center of this cultural phenomenon, its dance floors packed with celebrities, socialites, and ordinary people seeking extraordinary experiences. But beneath the glittering surface, tensions were building that would soon transform this kingdom of night into a battlefield where family loyalty would be tested against ambition and where the price of power would be measured in more than money. The summer of 1977 brought with it a heat that seemed to rise not just from the pavement, but from the very soul of the city itself. New York was burning with an energy that felt both creative and destructive, as if the entire metropolis was a powder keg waiting for the right spark. The blackout that would plunge the city into darkness was still weeks away, but already the air crackled with an electricity that made people feel like anything could happen for better or worse. At the Denmark, this electric atmosphere translated into the most successful season in the club's history. Every night brought capacity crowds that pressed against the velvet ropes, like pilgrims seeking entry to a sacred temple. The dance floor had become a stage where the drama of the decade played out in 3-minute songs, where the boundaries between performer and audience dissolved in a haze of sweat, perfume, and pure kinetic energy. Working alongside the Denmark family in orchestrating this nightly miracle was a man whose loyalty to Hamlet Sr. ran deeper than blood. Polonius Petrovich had started as a coat check attendant in the early days when the Denmark was just another nightclub with big dreams. His meticulous attention to detail and natural ability to read people had caught Hamlet Sr.'s attention, and over the years he had risen to become the club's general manager and the closest thing to a right-hand man that the elder Denmark trusted completely. Polonius was a man who understood that the devil lived in the details. While others might focus on the glamorous aspects of running a legendary nightclub, he paid attention to the mundane but crucial elements that made the magic possible. He knew exactly how many cases of champagne to order for a typical Saturday night, could predict which DJs would pack the floor and which would clear it, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot trouble before it started. His office, located on the 4th floor between the main business operations and the VIP lounges, served as the nerve center for the club's daily operations. The walls were covered with schedules, supplier contacts, employee records, and a complex chart tracking the preferences and habits of regular customers. To an outsider, it might have looked like the workspace of an obsessive accountant, but to those who understood the nightclub business, it represented the systematic approach that separated successful venues from failures. Polonius had brought his two children into the Denmark's extended family, though in very different capacities. His son Laertes had inherited his father's organizational skills, but channeled them toward the technical aspects of the club's operations. At 22, he was already being groomed as the next generation of management, spending his days learning every aspect of the business from sound engineering to customer relations. His daughter Ophelia, 19 and possessed of an ethereal beauty that seemed to glow under the club's ever-changing lights, had become an integral part of the Denmark's social ecosystem. She moved through the crowds like a guardian angel, her presence somehow making everyone around her feel more beautiful, more interesting, more alive. Her official title was Customer Relations Coordinator, but her real role was more complex and indefinable. She was the human embodiment of the club's welcoming spirit. The relationship between Harry Denmark and Ophelia had developed slowly over the years, evolving from childhood friendship to something deeper and more complicated. They had grown up together in the unique environment of the club, sharing experiences that no one outside their world could fully understand. While Harry struggled with questions about authenticity and meaning, Ophelia seemed to accept the club's reality with a grace that both impressed and occasionally frustrated him. Their conversations, conducted in quiet corners of the club during the brief lull between the dinner crowd and the late-night rush, had become increasingly philosophical, as Harry's university education exposed him to new ways of thinking about the world. He would question whether the happiness people found on the Denmark's dance floor was real or merely an illusion created by music, lights, and chemical enhancement. Ophelia would listen with the patience of someone who understood that questions mattered as much as answers, even when the questions led to uncomfortable conclusions. As July melted into August, the success that had defined the Denmark summer began to carry with it an undercurrent of unease that the most sensitive observers could feel, even if they couldn't articulate it. Hamlet Sr., despite his outward confidence and continued charismatic leadership, had begun to show signs of strain that those closest to him couldn't ignore. Late-night conversations between the elder Denmark and his wife had taken on a serious tone that hadn't been present in earlier years. Gertrude would find her husband standing at the windows of his penthouse office in the early morning hours, looking out over the city with an expression that suggested he was seeing something troubling in the landscape below. When she asked what was bothering him, he would speak in generalities about the changing nature of the business, the pressure from corporate interests, and his concerns about the direction the entire nightlife industry was heading. But there were more specific worries as well. Claudius's return from Las Vegas had brought with it ideas about expansion and modernization that made Hamlet Sr. uncomfortable. His younger brother spoke enthusiastically about franchising, the Denmark concept, creating a chain of clubs that could capitalize on the disco phenomenon in cities across the country. The financial projections he presented were impressive, but they required fundamental changes to the intimate, personal approach that had made the original Denmark successful. These philosophical differences between the brothers had begun to manifest in more concrete ways. Claudius had started meeting independently with suppliers and potential investors, presenting himself as a co-owner rather than simply an advisor. He had begun to suggest changes to the club's operations that Hamlet Sr. viewed as unnecessary commercialization of an experience that succeeded precisely because it felt authentic rather than manufactured. The staff had begun to notice these tensions, though they were too professional and too loyal to discuss them openly. But in the brief moments between shifts, in the quiet conversations that took place in the service areas where customers never ventured, there were whispered concerns about changes in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with the music or the lighting. As August reached its peak, with the city sweltering under a heat that seemed to press down on everything like a giant hand, the stage was set for events that would transform the Denmark from a kingdom of celebration into something darker and more dangerous. The players were all in position, their roles established through years of shared history and carefully maintained relationships. But beneath the surface of this glittering world, forces were stirring that would soon test every loyalty, challenge every assumption, and reveal that even in a place dedicated to joy and escape, the ancient themes of ambition, betrayal, and revenge could find fertile ground in which to grow. The night that changed everything arrived without warning, disguised as just another Saturday in late August when the Denmark pulsed with its usual intoxicating energy. The dance floor writhed with bodies moving to the hypnotic rhythms of "I Feel Love," Donna Summer's revolutionary 17-minute opus that had redefined what dance music could be. The massive sound system pushed Giorgio Moroder's synthesized beats through the crowd like electric current, each pulse perfectly synchronized with the strobing lights that transformed dancers into freeze-frame sculptures of pure ecstasy. Hamlet Sr. moved through this familiar chaos with his customary grace, but those who knew him well could detect something different in his bearing. He seemed more watchful than usual, his conversations shorter, his smiles requiring more effort. He had been receiving phone calls that he took in private, and twice that week he had met with lawyers whose presence in the club during business hours was unusual enough to generate whispered speculation among the staff. The evening progressed with typical Denmark intensity. Celebrities held court in the VIP lounges while models and socialites competed for attention on the main floor. The cocaine flowed as freely as the champagne, creating an atmosphere of artificial euphoria that masked the undercurrents of tension that had been building throughout the summer. By midnight, the club was operating at peak capacity, a perfectly orchestrated symphony of lights, sound, and human desire. It was during this peak moment that Hamlet Sr. excused himself from a conversation with a group of record executives and made his way to the private elevator that served only the top floors. He had told Gertrude he needed to review some contracts in his office, nothing unusual for a man who often conducted business, even during the club's busiest hours. She watched him disappear into the elevator with the casual attention of a wife accustomed to her husband's work habits, then returned her focus to the party swirling around them. What happened in that penthouse office during the next hour would remain forever shrouded in mystery, known only to two men, one of whom would never speak of it, and the other of whom would carry the secret like a poison in his veins. The official story, the one that would be repeated in police reports and newspaper articles, was tragically simple. Hamlet Denmark Sr., working late in his office while his nightclub celebrated below, had suffered a massive heart attack. The combination of stress, rich food, and the lifestyle that came with running New York's most famous nightclub had finally taken its toll on a man who had seemed invincible. Claudius Denmark found his brother's body at 2:30 in the morning. He had come to the penthouse, he later told investigators, because he was concerned about some business matters that required immediate attention. He discovered Hamlet Sr. slumped over his desk, still wearing the perfectly tailored suit he had put on for the evening's festivities. A half-empty bottle of Dom Perignon sat beside his elbow, and scattered across the desk were contracts and financial documents that suggested he had been working until the moment his heart stopped. The paramedics who responded to Claudius's frantic call could only confirm what was already obvious. Hamlet Denmark Sr. was dead, his body already growing cold in the air-conditioned silence of his penthouse office. The cause of death appeared straightforward: cardiac arrest brought on by the accumulated stresses of a high-pressure lifestyle. At 45, he had seemed to be in perfect health, but the medical examiner would later note that appearances could be deceiving, especially in a man who had spent years maintaining a public facade of effortless success. The news of his death spread through the Denmark like wildfire in a gasoline-soaked warehouse. The music stopped as if someone had pulled the plug on the entire city's electrical grid. The dancers froze in mid-motion, their bodies still swaying slightly to rhythms that were no longer playing. The lights seemed to dim of their own accord, and conversations died into silence as the reality of what had happened penetrated the chemical haze that had enveloped the night. Gertrude's scream, when she learned of her husband's death, was a sound that would haunt everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. It was a cry that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the human throat, a sound of loss so profound that it transformed the atmosphere of the entire building. She collapsed against Claudius, who held her with a tenderness that struck observers as both appropriate and somehow unsettling in its intimacy. The Denmark closed its doors that night for the first time in its history, the velvet ropes drawn across the entrance not to keep people out, but to keep grief in. The staff, many of whom had worked for Hamlet Sr. for years, wandered through the empty spaces like lost souls, unable to process the sudden transformation of their vibrant workplace into a mausoleum. Polonius took charge of the immediate practical matters with the efficiency that had made him indispensable to the operation. He contacted the authorities, managed the media inquiries that began within hours of the news breaking, and began the delicate process of notifying the extensive network of celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who had considered Hamlet Sr. not just a nightclub owner, but a friend. The funeral, held 4 days later, became an event that captured the attention of the entire city. St. Patrick's Cathedral was filled to capacity with mourners, whose presence together in one place would never be replicated. Politicians sat beside rock stars, fashion designers mourned alongside Wall Street executives, and the entire spectrum of New York's cultural elite gathered to pay their respects to a man who had somehow managed to bring them all together in life. But the most notable absence from this gathering was Harry Denmark himself. The young man had been unreachable at Columbia University, where his roommates reported that he had left several days earlier for what he described as a spiritual retreat in the mountains of upstate New York. By the time word of his father's death reached him, the funeral was over, and he returned to find a world that had been completely transformed in his absence. The Denmark that Harry came back to was operating under new management, with Claudius having stepped seamlessly into the role of owner and operator. The transition had been so smooth that customers barely noticed the change, though staff members were still adjusting to new management styles and policies that differed subtly but significantly from the approaches they had grown accustomed to under Hamlet Sr.'s leadership. Harry's return to the Denmark was like stepping into a funhouse mirror version of his former life, where everything appeared familiar but felt fundamentally wrong in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. The building looked exactly the same from the outside, the same gleaming chrome façade, the same neon sign blazing against the Manhattan night, the same velvet ropes controlling access to what the city's newspapers had dubbed the most exclusive square footage in America. But inside, subtle changes had already begun to alter the atmosphere that his father had spent years perfecting. The young man who had left for the mountains as the heir to a disco empire returned as an orphan, struggling to understand his place in a world that had reorganized itself around his absence. At 20 years old, Harry possessed his father's magnetic presence and his mother's intuitive intelligence, but he also carried within him the restless questioning spirit that his university education had cultivated. The philosophy and literature courses that had once seemed like intellectual luxuries now felt like essential tools for making sense of a reality that had become surreal overnight. Standing in the main entrance of the Denmark on his first night back, Harry watched his uncle Claudius work the room with a professional competence that was both impressive and unsettling. Where Hamlet Sr. had moved through crowds like a beloved friend greeting intimates at a private party, Claudius approached social interaction with the calculated precision of a politician working a campaign event. He remembered names and preferences with the same accuracy, made the same types of connections between disparate guests, but the emotional texture of these interactions felt different, more transactional, less genuinely warm. The staff responded to these changes with the adaptability that successful service professionals develop as a survival skill. They maintained their standards of excellence while adjusting to new management styles and priorities. But in the brief moments when they thought no one was watching, Harry could see the confusion and loss in their faces. These were people who had genuinely loved his father, and their grief was complicated by the necessity of continuing to function in a business environment that demanded constant performance. Ophelia's reaction to Harry's return revealed the depth of her own emotional investment in the Denmark family's well-being. She had grown up alongside Harry, sharing the unique experience of childhood spent in the adult world of nightclub culture. Her understanding of his loss was both personal and professional. She had lost not only a father figure who had helped shape her identity, but also the stable foundation upon which her entire world had been built. Their first conversation after his return took place in the early morning hours when the club was closed and the building felt like a vast, empty stage waiting for the next performance. They sat in one of the intimate lounges on the second floor, surrounded by the lingering sense of expensive perfume and champagne, while outside the windows Manhattan's skyline glittered with the promise of another day in a city that never truly slept. "Nothing feels the same anymore," Harry told her, his voice carrying the weight of grief mixed with bewilderment. "It's like someone took a photograph of my life and replaced it with a very good forgery. Everything looks right, but something essential has been removed." Ophelia listened with the patient attention that had always characterized her approach to the world. She understood that Harry's struggle went beyond simple grief over his father's death. He was grappling with questions about identity and authenticity that had no easy answers, especially in an environment where surface appearances mattered more than underlying realities. "Your father built something that was bigger than any one person," she said finally. "Even bigger than himself. The Denmark will continue because the magic he created was real, even if the person who created it is gone." But even as she spoke these comforting words, Ophelia could see that Harry was noticing details that troubled him. The way Claudius had already moved into the penthouse office that had been his brother's private sanctuary. The speed with which new policies and procedures were being implemented. The subtle but unmistakable signs that the new management viewed the Denmark less as a cultural institution and more as a business opportunity to be maximized. The most shocking development came exactly 1 month after Hamlet Sr.'s funeral, when Claudius and Gertrude announced their engagement with a speed that scandalized even the jaded social circles of New York nightlife. The official explanation emphasized the practical necessities of the situation, the need for stable leadership during a period of transition, the importance of maintaining family unity in the face of tragedy, the wisdom of combining their complementary skills to preserve what Hamlet Sr. had built. But the announcement hit Harry like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the possibility that the people closest to him might be strangers whose motivations he had never truly understood. His mother, whom he had always viewed as the perfect partner to his father's vision, now appeared capable of transferring her loyalty with a speed that suggested her emotional investments might be more strategic than he had realized. The engagement party, held at the Denmark itself, became a surreal spectacle that perfectly captured the disco era's capacity for transforming genuine human emotion into theatrical performance. Gertrude moved through the celebration wearing a flowing white dress that caught the light from the mirror balls and made her appear to glow with ethereal radiance. She accepted congratulations with gracious smiles while Claudius worked the room with the confidence of a man whose victory was complete and unassailable. Harry attended the party because his absence would have been noticed and commented upon, but he moved through the familiar spaces of the club like a ghost haunting his former life. He watched his mother dance with his uncle to "Love is in the Air," their bodies moving together with a compatibility that suggested their relationship had developed beyond the purely practical concerns they had cited. Publicly, the wedding itself, held just 2 weeks after the engagement announcement, was a smaller affair than might have been expected given the couple's prominence in New York's social hierarchy. The ceremony took place in a private dining room at the Denmark, with only immediate family and closest friends in attendance. Harry stood as his stepfather's best man, a role that felt like a betrayal of everything his father had represented, but which he accepted because the alternative public rebellion against his newly reconstituted family seemed even more impossible. As autumn settled over Manhattan, bringing with it the first hints of the winter that would eventually bury the city in snow and economic crisis, Harry found himself increasingly isolated within his own family's business. He had officially inherited his father's share of the Denmark, making him a co-owner with his new stepfather, but the practical realities of the situation left him with little actual influence over the club's operations. Claudius had moved quickly to consolidate power, surrounding himself with advisors and managers who owed their loyalty to him rather than to the Denmark family legacy. The changes he implemented were often subtle adjustments to staffing schedules, modifications to supplier contracts, alterations to the entertainment booking process, but their cumulative effect was to transform the Denmark from a family business into a corporate enterprise. Harry began spending more time alone, either in his apartment near Columbia or wandering the city streets in the early morning hours, when even New York's notorious energy seemed to ebb. He found himself drawn to the quieter neighborhoods of Manhattan, places where the disco fever that had consumed the city felt distant and artificial. These solitary walks became a form of meditation, a way of processing the grief and confusion that threatened to overwhelm him. It was during one of these pre-dawn wanderings that Harry first experienced the phenomenon that would change the course of his life and ultimately determine the fate of everyone connected to the Denmark. Walking through Central Park as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, he became aware of a presence that seemed to be following him, always remaining just at the edge of his peripheral vision. The apparition first appeared to Harry on a fog-shrouded night in early October, when Manhattan was wrapped in an unseasonably thick mist that rolled off the Hudson River like smoke from some massive, invisible fire. The city's usual neon brilliance was muted to soft halos of colored light that seemed to float disconnected from their sources, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a dream than the familiar landscape of his everyday life. Harry had been walking the empty streets since leaving the Denmark around 3 in the morning, unable to bear another moment of watching his uncle and mother move through their roles as the club's new royal couple. The sight of them together, Claudius's hand resting possessively on Gertrude's lower back as they surveyed their domain, her laugh brightening at his whispered comments, had filled him with a nausea that he couldn't rationalize but couldn't dismiss. The fog seemed to thicken as he made his way through the financial district, where the towering buildings created canyon-like spaces that trapped the mist and transformed familiar streets into something alien and otherworldly. It was here, standing beneath a flickering streetlight that cast sickly yellow illumination through the vapor, that Harry first saw the figure that would change everything he thought he knew about his father's death. At first, he dismissed the shape moving through the fog as another late-night wanderer, perhaps a taxi driver taking a break or a security guard making rounds. But as the figure drew closer, Harry felt his breath catch in his throat, and his heart begin to pound with a rhythm that seemed to match the distant bass line from some far-off disco. The man approaching through the mist wore a perfectly tailored suit that Harry recognized, moved with a familiar grace that made the young man's hands tremble, and possessed a presence that could belong to only one person in the entire world. "Dad?" Harry's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, lost almost immediately in the fog that seemed to swallow sound as effectively as it obscured vision. But the figure continued to approach, and as it drew near enough for Harry to see clearly, all doubt disappeared. Hamlet Denmark Sr. stood before his son, looking exactly as he had in life, but surrounded by an aura that made the surrounding mist seem to glow with its own internal light. The ghost of his father raised one hand in a gesture that was both greeting and command for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried all the warmth and authority that Harry remembered, but with an underlying quality that suggested it was coming from somewhere far beyond the ordinary world of nightclubs and neon lights. "My son," the ghost said, each word seeming to echo through the empty streets with supernatural resonance. "I have waited for this moment when I could speak to you alone, away from the eyes and ears of those who have stolen what was ours." Harry found himself unable to move, caught between the desire to embrace his father and the terror of realizing that the natural order of the world had been suspended in ways that his university education had never prepared him to understand. The rational part of his mind insisted that grief and stress had finally broken his grip on reality, but every instinct he possessed recognized the authentic presence of the man who had shaped his entire understanding of what it meant to be alive. "I know you have questions," the ghost continued, moving closer with steps that seemed to leave no impression on the fog-wet pavement. "I know you have felt that something was wrong, that the story they told about my death was incomplete. Trust those instincts, Harry. Trust the voice inside you that whispers of betrayal and murder." The word murder hit Harry like a physical blow, forcing him to lean against the nearest building for support. Everything he had been trying not to think, every suspicion he had dismissed as the product of grief and paranoia, suddenly crystallized into horrible clarity. His father's death had not been the result of natural causes. The speed of Claudius's transition into power, the unseemly haste of his marriage to Gertrude, the subtle changes in the club's atmosphere, all of it pointed toward a conspiracy that Harry had been too emotionally devastated to recognize. "Tell me," Harry managed to say, his voice stronger now as anger began to replace shock. "Tell me what really happened that night." The ghost of Hamlet Sr. moved closer still, until Harry could see every detail of his father's face, every line and expression that had been so familiar in life. But now those features were marked by a sadness that seemed to encompass not just personal grief, but a profound disappointment in human nature itself. "Your uncle came to my office that night with a bottle of champagne," the ghost began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "He spoke of business opportunities, of plans for expansion that would make us both rich beyond our current dreams. But the champagne he brought was poisoned with a substance that caused my heart to stop within minutes of drinking it. As I lay dying on the floor of my own office, Claudius arranged my body at the desk to make it appear that I had suffered a natural cardiac event." Harry felt the world shift around him, as if the fog-shrouded street was rotating on some invisible axis. Everything he had believed about his father's death, everything he had accepted about his family's grief and recovery, had been a carefully constructed lie, designed to conceal the most fundamental betrayal imaginable. But why? Harry asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Why would he kill you? He had everything he could want, a place in the business, respect in the industry, financial security. Because he wanted it all, the ghost replied, his voice hardening with an anger that made the surrounding fog seem to writhe with supernatural energy. He wanted the Denmark, he wanted your mother, and he wanted the power that came with being the undisputed king of New York's nightlife empire. My death gave him all of these things, and my marriage to Gertrude legitimized his claim to everything I had built. The implications of this revelation crashed over Harry like a wave of ice water. His mother's rapid remarriage was not the result of grief-seeking comfort, but part of a conspiracy that had been planned before his father's body was even cold. The woman he had trusted above all others had betrayed the memory of the man she had supposedly loved, participating in a scheme that had transformed her from widow to willing accomplice. "What must I do?" Harry asked, the question emerging from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. He understood instinctively that his father's ghost had not appeared merely to share information, but to demand action that would restore the moral balance that Claudius's crime had destroyed. "You must expose the truth," the ghost replied, beginning to fade as the fog around them started to thin with the approaching dawn. "You must find evidence of what was done and ensure that justice is served. But be careful, my son. Claudius is clever and ruthless, and he has surrounded himself with people who benefit from the current arrangement. Trust no one completely, and remember that the price of revenge is often higher than the cost of the original crime." As the first rays of sunlight began to penetrate the dissipating mist, the ghost of Hamlet Sr. became increasingly transparent, until Harry could see through his father's form to the buildings beyond. But the final words the apparition spoke carried with crystal clarity through the morning air. "Remember me, Harry. Remember what the Denmark was meant to be, and do not let my murder go unpunished. But above all, remember that some forms of justice require a man to risk everything he holds dear, including his own soul." And then the ghost was gone, leaving Harry alone on the empty street with knowledge that would transform him from a grieving son into an instrument of vengeance, setting in motion events that would ultimately destroy everyone connected to the disco empire his father had built with such love and care. The weeks following Harry's supernatural encounter with his father's ghost transformed the young man into someone his closest friends barely recognized. Where once he had been introspective but engaged, he now moved through the Denmark like a stranger studying an alien culture, his eyes holding an intensity that made people uncomfortable without understanding why. His behavior became increasingly erratic, swinging between periods of manic energy where he would dance with desperate abandon on the club's main floor, and stretches of brooding silence where he would disappear for days without explanation. The staff began to whisper about the young Denmark heir's deteriorating mental state, attributing his strange behavior to grief over his father's death and adjustment difficulties with the new family arrangement. But those closest to Harry sensed that something deeper and more troubling was driving his transformation from the thoughtful young man they had known into someone who seemed to be conducting his own private war against invisible enemies. Ophelia bore the brunt of Harry's psychological turmoil, finding herself the target of his increasingly bizarre and hurtful behavior. During conversations that had once been intimate and supportive, he would suddenly turn cruel, speaking to her with a coldness that seemed designed to drive her away. He would appear at her apartment at odd hours, his clothes disheveled and his eyes wild with an energy that frightened her, speaking in riddles and half-formed accusations that made no sense but carried an underlying threat that made her afraid to ask for clarification. "You're all the same," he told her during one particularly disturbing late-night visit, pacing through her small studio apartment like a caged animal. "You present yourselves as innocent and pure, but underneath you're calculating and corrupt, willing to betray anyone if the price is right. How do I know you're not reporting everything I say back to my dear stepfather?" These attacks on her character wounded Ophelia more deeply than Harry could have imagined. She had genuinely loved him, first as a childhood companion, and later as something approaching a soulmate who shared her understanding of the unique world they had grown up in. To have that love thrown back at her with such contempt and suspicion was destroying her emotional equilibrium in ways that paralleled Harry's own psychological decline. Polonius watched his daughter's suffering with increasing concern and growing anger toward the young man he had once considered almost a son. The older man had dedicated his professional life to serving the Denmark family, but his paternal instincts were stronger than his business loyalty. He began to document Harry's erratic behavior, keeping detailed records of incidents that suggested the heir to the Denmark Empire was becoming genuinely unstable. "The boy is losing his mind," Polonius confided to Claudius during one of their regular morning meetings in the penthouse office that had once belonged to Hamlet Sr. "His grief has twisted into something unhealthy, and I'm concerned about what he might do if his condition continues to deteriorate. He's become obsessed with conspiracy theories about his father's death, and he's starting to make accusations that could damage the club's reputation if they became public." Claudius listened to these reports with the careful attention of a man who understood that Harry's suspicions, however irrational they might appear, posed a genuine threat to everything he had worked to achieve. The new owner of the Denmark had spent considerable effort creating a seamless transition of power that maintained the club's reputation while expanding its profitability. Any suggestion that Hamlet Sr.'s death had been anything other than a tragic natural occurrence could unravel the carefully constructed narrative that had legitimized his marriage to Gertrude and his assumption of control over the nightclub empire. "Perhaps Harry needs professional help," Claudius suggested with apparent concern for his stepson's welfare. "Grief counseling, or maybe a retreat somewhere quiet where he can process his emotions without the stimulation of the city. The Denmark environment might be too overwhelming for someone in his current state." But even as he spoke these words of apparent compassion, Claudius was calculating more direct approaches to the problem his nephew represented. Harry's inheritance made him a co-owner of the Denmark, which meant that his deteriorating mental state could potentially be used to justify legal proceedings that would remove him from any active role in the business. With the right medical documentation and legal maneuvering, it might be possible to have Harry declared incompetent, clearing the way for Claudius to assume complete control of the empire he had killed to obtain. Harry, meanwhile, was developing his own strategy for exposing the truth about his father's murder. The ghost's warning about trusting no one had taken deep root in his mind, making him paranoid about every interaction and suspicious of every friendly gesture. But it had also sharpened his analytical abilities, forcing him to think like a detective gathering evidence for a case that would have to be proved beyond any reasonable doubt. The challenge was that Claudius had covered his tracks with professional thoroughness. The champagne bottle that had contained the poison was gone, presumably destroyed along with any other physical evidence that might have connected the new owner to his brother's death. The medical examiner's report had been filed and accepted without question, the death certificate had been issued, and the official cause of death was established in legal documents that would be difficult to challenge without compelling new evidence. Harry began to spend hours in the New York Public Library, researching poisons that could cause heart failure while leaving minimal traces in the bloodstream. He studied the symptoms of various toxic substances, looking for patterns that might match what his father had experienced during his final moments. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that the ghost had spoken the truth. Hamlet Sr. had been murdered, in a way specifically designed to avoid detection during a routine autopsy. But knowledge of the method was not enough to prove the crime. Harry needed something that would force Claudius to reveal his guilt, some strategy that would make the murderer betray himself through his own actions and reactions. It was during this period of planning that Harry conceived of an idea that would transform the Denmark itself into a stage for exposing the truth about his father's death. The inspiration came from his university literature courses, specifically his study of Elizabethan drama and the device of the play within a play that Shakespeare had used in several of his works. If Claudius had murdered Hamlet Sr. using poison and champagne, then perhaps a dramatic recreation of similar events might provoke a reaction that would confirm his guilt. The Denmark's theatrical atmosphere and capacity for spectacular entertainment made it the perfect venue for such a psychological experiment. Harry began to develop plans for a special event at the club, something that would appear to be a memorial celebration for his father but would actually serve as an elaborate trap designed to catch a murderer. The evening would feature entertainment that would recreate in symbolic form the circumstances of Hamlet Sr.'s death, creating a situation where Claudius would be forced to confront his crime in front of an audience that included everyone who mattered in their social circle. The plan that crystallized in Harry's mind during those long October nights combined theatrical drama with psychological warfare, using the Denmark's capacity for spectacular entertainment as a weapon against the man who had stolen everything his father had built. He would organize a memorial celebration for Hamlet Sr., ostensibly to honor the one-year anniversary of the club's greatest era, but actually designed as an elaborate psychological trap that would force Claudius to confront his guilt in the most public possible forum. Harry spent weeks developing the concept, drawing on his knowledge of theater and his intimate understanding of the Denmark's technical capabilities. The event would feature a multimedia presentation combining live performance with film projections, music with dramatic narrative, creating an immersive experience that would tell the story of a nightclub owner's rise to power and sudden mysterious death. The parallels to real events would be unmistakable to anyone who had lived through the Denmark family's recent history. The preparation of this elaborate performance required Harry to interact with staff members and outside contractors while maintaining the facade of mental instability that had become his protective cover. To most observers, he appeared to be channeling his grief into an artistic project, a memorial tribute that would serve as both catharsis and celebration. Only Harry knew that the real purpose was to create a mirror that would reflect Claudius's guilt back at him with such intensity that even a professional murderer would be unable to maintain his composure. But the psychological pressure of maintaining this deception while planning his revenge was taking an increasingly severe toll on Harry's mental and emotional stability. The line between performed madness and genuine psychological breakdown was becoming dangerously thin, and there were moments when he could no longer distinguish between the role he was playing and the person he was becoming. It was during one of these periods of profound disorientation that Harry found himself standing alone on the observation deck of the Empire State Building at 3 a.m, having gained access through connections in the nightlife world that opened doors throughout the city. The wind at that height was bitter cold, cutting through his inadequate jacket and making his eyes water as he stared down at the grid of lights that stretched in every direction below him. The city looked different from this perspective, less chaotic, more organized, as if the street-level complexity that defined New York was actually part of some larger pattern that could only be perceived from sufficient distance. Harry found himself contemplating whether his own situation might become clearer if he could somehow step outside it entirely, viewing his life from the kind of objective perspective that was impossible while living inside the circumstances that defined his daily existence. The thought of ending his suffering by stepping off the building's edge presented itself with a seductive simplicity that frightened him with its appeal. Death would solve all of his problems simultaneously: the burden of knowledge about his father's murder, the impossible task of proving Claudius's guilt, the pain of seeing his mother living happily with her husband's killer, the isolation that came from being unable to trust anyone with the truth about what he had learned. To be or not to be, Harry whispered into the wind, the famous words taking on new meaning in the context of his impossible situation. Whether it's nobler to suffer through this nightmare, or to take action that might destroy everyone I claim to love. But even as he contemplated the appeal of escape through death, Harry realized that suicide would represent the ultimate victory for Claudius. His stepfather would inherit complete control of the Denmark Empire. His mother would never learn the truth about her husband's murder, and his father's ghost would remain forever unavenged. The thought of Claudius standing over his grave with the same false grief he had displayed at Hamlet Sr.'s funeral was enough to pull Harry back from the edge, both literally and figuratively. He returned to the Denmark that night, with renewed determination to see his plan through to completion, regardless of the personal cost. The memorial celebration would proceed as scheduled, and if it destroyed him in the process of exposing Claudius's guilt, that would be an acceptable price for ensuring that justice was finally served. The announcement of the memorial event generated considerable excitement throughout New York's nightlife community. Hamlet Sr. had been genuinely beloved, not just for his success but for his generous spirit and authentic warmth. The prospect of a celebration that would honor his memory while showcasing the Denmark's legendary capacity for spectacular entertainment drew enthusiastic responses from celebrities, socialites, and industry professionals who had benefited from his friendship and patronage. Claudius initially expressed reservations about the timing and tone of such an event, suggesting that it might be more appropriate to wait until emotions had cooled and the family had achieved greater distance from their grief. But his objections were overruled by Gertrude, who saw the memorial as an opportunity to demonstrate that the Denmark could honor its past while embracing its future under new leadership. "Harry needs this," she told her husband during one of their private conversations in the penthouse office. He needs a way to process his feelings about his father's death. And if organizing this tribute helps him find some peace, we should support it completely. Claudius agreed with apparent reluctance, recognizing that opposition to the memorial would appear suspicious and potentially damaging to his reputation as a caring stepfather. But privately, he began to make preparations for dealing with whatever surprises Harry might have planned. His network of informants among the club's staff kept him informed about the general nature of the entertainment being prepared, though Harry had been careful to keep the most revealing details secret. As the date of the memorial approached, the psychological pressure on all of the Denmark family members intensified in different ways. Harry threw himself into the final preparations with manic energy, working 18-hour days to ensure that every technical detail was perfect. His behavior became increasingly erratic, and his conversations with staff members often included cryptic references to justice and truth that made people uncomfortable without being explicitly threatening. Ophelia watched this escalation with growing alarm, recognizing that Harry was approaching some kind of psychological crisis that would either resolve his internal conflicts or destroy him entirely. She tried repeatedly to reach out to him, offering support and understanding, but her attempts at connection were met with suspicion and rejection that became more hurtful with each encounter. "Why do you keep pretending to care about me?" Harry asked her during one particularly cruel confrontation in the club's empty VIP lounge. "Everyone else has chosen their side in this game, so why are you still playing innocent? Are you working for him now? Are you reporting everything I do back to my stepfather?" The accusation hit Ophelia like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it revealed the depth of Harry's paranoia and the complete breakdown of trust that had once defined their relationship. She realized that the man she had loved was disappearing, replaced by someone whose pain had transformed into something destructive and dangerous. Polonius's concern for his daughter's welfare finally overcame his loyalty to the Denmark family, leading him to make a decision that would have consequences extending far beyond his original intentions. He arranged to meet privately with Gertrude, hoping to convince her to intervene before Harry's deteriorating mental state caused irreparable damage to everyone involved. The meeting took place in Gertrude's private office, a space that had been redecorated since her marriage to Claudius, but still retained some of the elegant warmth that had characterized her approach to the club's social environment. Polonius entered the conversation with careful diplomacy, but his parental concern quickly overcame his professional restraint. "Mrs. Denmark, I'm worried about Harry's effect on my daughter," he said, abandoning the formal protocols that usually governed their interactions. "His behavior has become unpredictable and sometimes cruel. Ophelia is suffering, and I'm not sure how much more she can endure before her own emotional stability is compromised." Gertrude listened with the careful attention of a woman who had her own concerns about her son's psychological state. She had noticed the changes in Harry's behavior, the wild swings between manic energy and brooding withdrawal, but she had attributed them to grief and the natural difficulties of adjusting to the new family arrangement. The night of the memorial celebration arrived, with all the electric anticipation that had once characterized the Denmark's greatest events during Hamlet Sr.'s lifetime. The club had been transformed into something that transcended its usual role as a nighttime entertainment venue, becoming instead a theatrical space where reality and performance would blur in ways that none of the guests could have anticipated. Harry had spent days overseeing the installation of additional lighting equipment, projection screens, and sound systems that would support the multimedia presentation he had created as his father's tribute and his stepfather's trap. The guest list read like a comprehensive directory of New York's cultural elite, everyone who had been touched by Hamlet Sr.'s generous spirit and magnetic presence. Politicians mingled with rock stars, fashion designers shared champagne with Wall Street executives, and the entire spectrum of the city's nightlife aristocracy gathered in the same space where they had celebrated countless nights during the golden era of the Denmark's reign over Manhattan's social landscape. Claudius moved through this crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to wear his stolen crown without visible discomfort, greeting guests with appropriate warmth while maintaining the careful balance between celebration and mourning that the evening required. But those who knew him well could detect an underlying tension in his manner, a slight stiffness in his smile that suggested he was prepared for something unpleasant to occur before the night was over. Gertrude, radiant in a flowing black dress that managed to be both mournful and sensual, served as the perfect hostess for an event that honored her first husband while celebrating her new marriage. She moved through the party with grace that made her appear to float rather than walk, accepting condolences and congratulations with equal warmth, while carefully avoiding any mention of the specific details surrounding Hamlet Sr.'s death. As midnight approached, Harry took the stage that had been erected on the main dance floor, his appearance drawing immediate attention from the assembled crowd. He looked haggard and intense, his usual careful grooming replaced by a wild-eyed energy that made him appear simultaneously charismatic and dangerous. When he spoke, his voice carried throughout the club's sophisticated sound system with crystal clarity that ensured no one would miss a single word. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends and family, welcome to this celebration of my father's life and legacy," Harry began, his words carrying an undertone that made the more perceptive guests sense that something unusual was about to unfold. "Tonight, we're going to tell the story of a man who built an empire through vision and generosity, and whose sudden death shocked everyone who knew him." The multimedia presentation that followed was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation disguised as artistic tribute. Using a combination of film footage, live actors, and carefully synchronized lighting effects, Harry recreated the rise and fall of a nightclub dynasty that paralleled his family's history in every significant detail, except the names of the characters involved. The performance began with the story of two brothers who shared a dream of creating the perfect nightclub, a place where the magic of music and human connection could transform ordinary nights into extraordinary experiences. The elder brother was portrayed as a visionary whose success came from genuine love for the people he served, while the younger brother was shown as increasingly resentful of his secondary role in the empire they had built together. As the dramatic narrative progressed, the audience watched the younger brother's jealousy grow into something darker and more dangerous. The live actors, directed by Harry with meticulous attention to psychological detail, performed scenes that showed the progression from sibling rivalry to murderous conspiracy, culminating in a recreation of the older brother's death that was unmistakably similar to the circumstances surrounding Hamlet Sr.'s final night. The climactic scene showed the younger brother entering his sibling's office with a bottle of champagne, ostensibly to celebrate a business success but actually to deliver poison that would cause a heart attack indistinguishable from natural causes. The actor playing the murderous brother delivered lines that Harry had written specifically to provoke a response from Claudius, words that any guilty party would recognize as accusations disguised as entertainment. "To my dear brother," the actor said, raising the poisoned champagne in a toast, who never suspected that his greatest enemy lived in his own family, who trusted the wrong person with his life, and who died believing that love and loyalty were stronger than greed and ambition. The effect on Claudius was immediate and unmistakable. His face went white, then flushed red with a combination of rage and terror. He stood abruptly from his VIP table, knocking over his champagne glass and causing a commotion that drew attention from nearby guests. For a moment, he appeared to be struggling with the decision of whether to flee the club entirely or attempt to stop the performance before it could reveal any more damaging details. "This is disgusting," Claudius shouted, his voice carrying enough authority to temporarily halt the music and performance. "Using my brother's memory for this kind of sick entertainment is an insult to everything he stood for. This event is over." But Harry was not finished with his psychological assault. As Claudius moved toward the exit, the young man grabbed a microphone and addressed his stepfather directly, abandoning any pretense of artistic metaphor for direct accusation that electrified the assembled crowd. "Running away so soon, uncle?" Harry's voice boomed through the sound system with amplified intensity that made his words impossible to ignore. "Don't you want to see how the story ends? Don't you want to know what happens when the truth finally comes out about how my father really died?" The confrontation that followed sent shockwaves through the crowd, as guests realized they were witnessing not entertainment, but the exposure of a real family crisis that had been hidden beneath the surface of recent events. Claudius, recognizing that his reaction had already revealed too much, attempted to regain control by ordering security to remove Harry from the premises. But the young man's accusations had already planted seeds of doubt that would grow into scandal within hours. The party dissolved into chaos as guests fled the club, eager to distance themselves from a situation that threatened to become a criminal investigation. Within minutes, the Denmark was empty except for family members and staff who were too shocked to leave or too loyal to abandon their posts during a crisis. Harry, Energized by the success of his trap, but also pushed beyond the edge of rational thought by months of accumulated pressure, demanded a private confrontation with his mother. He found her in her office, where she had retreated to escape the mayhem in the main club, and began an interrogation that quickly escalated into the most brutal conversation of both their lives. "How could you do it?" Harry demanded, his voice hoarse from shouting but still carrying the intensity that had characterized his entire performance that evening. "How could you marry the man who murdered your husband? How could you betray everything my father represented?" Gertrude, still reeling from the night's revelations, initially tried to defend her actions as practical necessities driven by grief and the need for stability. But Harry's relentless questioning and obvious knowledge of details that should have been impossible for him to know gradually wore down her defenses until she was forced to confront the possibility that her son's accusations might be based on more than paranoid delusions. Unknown to both of them, Polonius had hidden himself behind the heavy curtains that covered the office windows, hoping to overhear the conversation and gather information that might help him understand the full scope of the crisis that was destroying the Denmark family. His loyalty to the organization that had been his life's work had overcome his better judgment, leading him to spy on a conversation that was never meant for outside ears. When Harry noticed the slight movement of the curtains that betrayed the presence of someone listening to their private confrontation, his paranoia and rage combined into a moment of violence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Without pausing to consider who might be hiding there or what their motivations might be, he grabbed a heavy crystal paperweight from his mother's desk and hurled it with all his strength at the concealed figure. The sound of impact was sickening, followed immediately by a groan of pain and the thud of a body falling to the floor. When Harry pulled back the curtains, he found Polonius lying unconscious, blood spreading from a head wound that would prove to be fatal. The man who had dedicated his career to serving the Denmark family had become an accidental victim of the revenge that Harry had planned so carefully, but was now executing with reckless desperation. Gertrude's scream of horror at the sight of Polonius's body cut through the night like a siren, alerting everyone remaining in the building that the evening's disasters had escalated beyond family drama into genuine tragedy. The loyal manager who had kept the Denmark running smoothly through every crisis was dying on the floor of an office where he had spent countless hours working to preserve the legacy that was now destroying itself from within. As sirens wailed in the distance, announcing the arrival of police and paramedics who would transform the club into a crime scene, Harry realized that his quest for justice had transformed him into something he had never intended to become: a killer whose actions had claimed an innocent life while still leaving his father's real murderer free to escape the consequences of his own crimes. The death of Polonius Petrovich transformed the Denmark from a crime scene into a media circus overnight, with news vans and photographers camping outside the club's chrome entrance like vultures waiting for fresh carrion. The story had everything that sold newspapers in 1977: murder, family betrayal, sex, drugs, and the downfall of New York's most glamorous nightclub dynasty. Within hours, the Denmark family's private tragedy had become public entertainment for a city that thrived on the spectacular failures of its most celebrated citizens. Police tapes sectioned off entire floors of the building while detectives conducted interviews with staff members who had witnessed the evening's events. The official investigation focused on the circumstances surrounding Polonius's death, treating it as either a case of manslaughter during a domestic dispute or possibly premeditated murder, depending on how Harry's mental state was ultimately evaluated by court-appointed psychiatrists. Harry himself had been taken into custody immediately after Polonius's body was discovered, though his arrest was handled with the discretion that the Denmark family's wealth and connections still commanded despite the scandal. Instead of being processed through the standard criminal justice system, he was admitted to a private psychiatric facility in Westchester County, where he could receive treatment, while authorities determined whether he was competent to stand trial for the charges that would inevitably follow. Claudius moved quickly to contain the damage to both his reputation and his business interests, hiring the most expensive crisis management team in the city to control the narrative that was emerging in the press coverage. The official story portrayed Harry's breakdown as a tragic consequence of unresolved grief over his father's death, compounded by the stress of adjusting to his family's new configuration. Any suggestion that Harry's accusations against Claudius might have merit was dismissed as the delusional ranting of a young man who had lost touch with reality. This is a family tragedy that has been compounded by mental illness. Claudius told reporters during a carefully staged press conference held in the Denmark's main dining room. Harry is a sensitive young man who never fully processed his grief over losing his father, and that unresolved pain has manifested itself in paranoid delusions that have now cost an innocent man his life. The performance was masterful, combining apparent compassion for his stepson with subtle implications that Harry had always been emotionally unstable. Claudius presented himself as a grieving family member who was doing everything possible to get appropriate help for a relative whose mental health problems had tragically escalated beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. But privately, Claudius was calculating more permanent solutions to the problem that Harry represented. Even if the young man was declared incompetent to stand trial, even if he spent years in psychiatric treatment, he would always remain a threat as long as he maintained his accusations about Hamlet Sr.'s murder. The ghost's revelation had given Harry knowledge that made him dangerous, and that danger would only increase if he ever regained his credibility or found a way to substantiate his claims with evidence. The psychiatric facility where Harry was being held was one of the most exclusive in the country, a place where wealthy families traditionally sent their troubled relatives for discreet treatment that emphasized privacy over publicity. The grounds resembled a luxury resort more than a medical institution, with manicured gardens and elegant buildings that could have housed a small university. But despite the pleasant surroundings, Harry quickly discovered that he was essentially a prisoner whose freedom depended on convincing his doctors that he no longer posed a threat to himself or others. Dr. Elizabeth Rosencrantz, the psychiatrist assigned to Harry's case, was a woman whose reputation had been built on her ability to help prominent families resolve their most embarrassing problems with minimal public exposure. She approached Harry's treatment with the assumption that his accusations against Claudius were symptoms of a paranoid disorder that could be managed through appropriate medication and therapy. "Harry, I want you to understand that you're in a safe place now," Dr. Rosencrantz told him during their first session, conducted in an office that overlooked the facility's peaceful gardens. "You've been under tremendous stress, and that stress has caused your mind to create explanations for events that may not reflect reality. My job is to help you distinguish between what actually happened and what your grief and anger have led you to believe happened." But Harry's time in the psychiatric facility had not diminished his conviction that his father had been murdered. If anything, the enforced isolation and constant evaluation had sharpened his focus, making him more determined than ever to find a way to expose Claudius's crime. He quickly learned to present himself as a model patient who was making progress in his recovery, while privately developing new strategies for continuing his quest for justice. Meanwhile, the impact of Polonius's death was devastating his children in ways that would have long-lasting consequences for everyone connected to the Denmark. Laertes, who had been in Paris studying international business when his father was killed, received the news through a transatlantic phone call that shattered his world as completely as Harry's world had been shattered by his father's death months earlier. But where Harry had responded to tragedy with introspection and careful planning, Laertes reacted with immediate and uncontrolled rage. He abandoned his studies and flew back to New York within hours of learning about his father's death, arriving at Kennedy Airport with nothing but a burning desire for revenge against the man who had destroyed his family. Laertes's first stop was the Denmark, where he confronted the security guards who attempted to prevent him from entering what was still technically a crime scene. His fury was so intense that the guards, who had known him since childhood, stepped aside rather than physically restrain a young man whose grief had transformed him into something dangerous and unpredictable. "Where is he?" Laertes shouted as he burst into the main club area, his voice echoing through the empty space that had once pulsed with music and laughter. "Where is the coward who killed my father and then hid behind lawyers and psychiatrists?" Claudius, who had been meeting with his attorneys in the penthouse office, heard the commotion and immediately understood that Laertes represented a new and potentially more dangerous threat than Harry had ever posed. Where Harry's accusations were dismissed as the product of mental illness, Laertes had credibility as the grieving son of a murdered man whose anger would be seen as both natural and justified. The confrontation between Claudius and Laertes took place in the same office where Polonius had died, with the bloodstains on the carpet serving as a gruesome reminder of the violence that had already torn through the Denmark family's carefully constructed world. But instead of allowing Laertes's rage to escalate into physical violence, Claudius demonstrated the psychological manipulation skills that had made him successful in business and deadly in family politics. "Laertes, I understand your anger," Claudius said, his voice carrying exactly the right combination of sympathy and authority. "Your father was a good man who didn't deserve to die, especially not in such a senseless, tragic way. But your anger is directed at the wrong person. I'm not your enemy, I'm the one person who can help you get justice for what happened to Polonius." The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of misdirection, as Claudius gradually redirected Laertes' fury away from himself and toward Harry, whom he portrayed as an unstable young man whose mental illness had made him a danger to everyone around him. He provided just enough accurate information about Harry's erratic behavior to make his version of events seem credible, while carefully avoiding any mention of the accusations that had precipitated the night's violence. "Harry needs help, not punishment," Claudius explained, presenting himself as a compassionate family member torn between his desire for justice and his responsibility to his stepson. "But that doesn't mean he should escape the consequences of what he's done. The question is whether we handle this through the legal system, which could take years and might not result in justice, or whether we find a more direct way to ensure that your father's death is properly avenged." The suggestion that Claudius planted in Laertes' mind during their confrontation took root like a poisonous seed, growing stronger with each passing hour, as the young man contemplated the various ways that justice might be served outside the conventional legal system. The idea of challenging Harry to some form of personal combat appealed to Laertes' sense of honor while offering the immediate satisfaction that months or years of court proceedings could never provide. But even as Claudius was successfully manipulating Laertes into becoming his instrument of revenge, another tragedy was unfolding that would claim an innocent victim whose only crime had been loving someone whose madness had made him incapable of returning that love. Ophelia Petrovich, already devastated by her father's death and Harry's cruel rejection, was descending into a psychological abyss that made Harry's performed madness seem stable by comparison. The combination of losing her father and watching the man she loved transform into someone who treated her with contempt had shattered Ophelia's emotional equilibrium in ways that no one around her fully understood. Unlike Harry, whose madness was at least partially strategic, Ophelia's breakdown was genuine and complete, a total disconnect from reality that manifested itself in behavior that was both heartbreaking and increasingly dangerous. She began appearing at the Denmark during the day, when the club was closed for cleaning and maintenance, wandering through the empty spaces like a ghost haunting the scenes of her former happiness. The staff members who encountered her during these visits were disturbed by her appearance and behavior. She would dance alone on the main floor to music that only she could hear, singing fragments of disco songs mixed with children's nursery rhymes, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. Dancing queen, young and sweet, only 17, Ophelia would sing, her voice echoing through the empty club with a haunting quality that made janitors and maintenance workers stop their work to listen. But the familiar lyrics would gradually dissolve into nonsensical combinations of words that suggested her mind was creating its own reality from the fragments of her shattered world. Her brother Laertes, consumed with his own grief and plans for revenge, was too distracted to recognize the severity of his sister's condition. When friends and former colleagues tried to draw his attention to Ophelia's behavior, he dismissed their concerns as natural grief that would resolve itself once he had secured justice for their father's death. The idea that his sister might be in immediate danger never penetrated his focus on settling the score with Harry. Dr. Rosencrantz had recommended that Ophelia receive professional counseling to help her process the trauma of her father's death, but the suggestion had been lost in the chaos of criminal investigations and family conflicts that consumed everyone's attention. The young woman who had once served as the Denmark's unofficial ambassador of joy and welcome was now invisible to the very people who should have been protecting her. The tragic end came on a rainy November evening when Manhattan was shrouded in the kind of cold, penetrating mist that made the city feel like a vast cemetery. Ophelia had spent the afternoon at the Denmark, moving through the empty building like she was searching for something that could never be found. Security cameras would later show her in various locations throughout the club, sometimes dancing, sometimes sitting motionless for hours, always alone. As evening approached, she made her way to the building's rooftop terrace, a space that Hamlet Sr. had designed as a private retreat where he could escape the intensity of the club's atmosphere. The terrace featured a small garden with planters full of flowers that had long since died in the autumn cold, and a decorative fountain that had been turned off for the winter. It was here that Ophelia's fragmented mind created its final, fatal delusion. Witnesses from neighboring buildings would later report seeing a young woman on the Denmark's rooftop, singing and distributing imaginary flowers to invisible companions. She appeared to be hosting a garden party for guests that only she could see, moving through elaborate social rituals that made perfect sense in her private reality, but looked like the actions of someone completely disconnected from the world around her. The fountain, though not operational, still contained several feet of stagnant water that had accumulated from recent rains. In Ophelia's distorted perception, this murky pool had somehow transformed into a clear stream where she could gather flowers for the ghostly party guests who populated her hallucinations. She climbed into the fountain fully clothed, her long hair and flowing dress spreading around her like water lilies, as she bent to collect blossoms that existed nowhere but in her shattered imagination. The water was deeper than she had realized, and her heavy clothing quickly became waterlogged, pulling her down into the dark pool. But even as she drowned, witnesses reported that she continued to sing, her voice growing fainter but never stopping until the water finally closed over her head. The songs she sang in those final moments were a mixture of disco hits and lullabies, creating a soundtrack for her death that captured both the glamorous world she had known and the innocent childhood that had been lost forever. By the time security guards discovered her body floating in the rooftop fountain, Ophelia had been dead for hours. The sight of her corpse, surrounded by the wilted flowers she had been trying to gather, became one of the most haunting images associated with the Denmark's downfall. Photographers who managed to gain access to the scene captured pictures that would appear on newspaper front pages across the country, transforming Ophelia's private tragedy into a symbol of the era's excesses and the price paid by innocents caught in the crossfire of other people's ambitions. News of Ophelia's death reached Harry at the psychiatric facility through a television news report that played in the common room where patients gathered for recreational activities. The sight of her body being removed from the building where they had shared so many moments of happiness hit him with a grief that was qualitatively different from anything he had experienced since his father's murder. This was not the calculated rage that had sustained his quest for revenge, but pure sorrow for the loss of someone whose only crime had been loving him too much to save herself. The realization that his performed madness had contributed to driving a genuinely innocent person to suicide added another layer of guilt to the psychological burden he was already carrying. The news also reached Laertes at the Denmark, where he had been meeting with Claudius to finalize their plans for dealing with Harry. The impact on the young man was instantaneous and devastating. His sister's death transformed his desire for revenge from a matter of family honor into a burning need for blood that could not be satisfied through any civilized means. "She's dead because of him," Laertes said, his voice carrying a flatness that was more frightening than any display of emotion could have been. "My father is dead because of him. My sister is dead because of him. And my entire family has been destroyed because of him. I don't care about trials or psychiatric evaluations or legal procedures. I want him dead, and I want to be the one who kills him." Claudius recognized that Laertes' grief had pushed him beyond the point where careful manipulation was necessary. The young man's desire for revenge had evolved into something that could be directed with minimal effort toward the outcome that would solve all of Claudius's problems simultaneously. If Laertes killed Harry in what appeared to be a fair fight, both of the main threats to Claudius's position would be eliminated. Harry would be dead, and Laertes would likely face criminal charges that would remove him from the picture as well. "There might be a way to arrange what you're looking for," Claudius said carefully, his words chosen to appear supportive rather than manipulative. "Harry will eventually be released from the psychiatric facility, probably sooner than most people expect. When that happens, we could arrange a meeting between the two of you that would allow you to settle this matter according to your own sense of what justice requires." The plan that emerged from this conversation would transform the Denmark's main dance floor into an arena for a confrontation that would serve as both personal combat and public spectacle. Using the club's capacity for dramatic entertainment, they would stage what appeared to be a reconciliation ceremony between Harry and Laertes, but which would actually provide cover for a duel that would almost certainly result in Harry's death. The details were worked out with meticulous care, taking advantage of both men's competitive backgrounds to create a scenario that would appear accidental to outside observers. Both Harry and Laertes had been amateur fencing champions during their university years, making a friendly match between them seem like a natural way to demonstrate that their family dispute had been resolved. But the swords that would be used in this friendly competition would be real rather than practice weapons. And Laertes' blade would carry a special modification that would ensure any wound it inflicted would be fatal within minutes. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. If everything went according to Claudius's design, Harry would die in what appeared to be a tragic accident during a sporting event intended to heal the wounds that had torn their families apart. The psychiatric facility released Harry Denmark back into the world on a cold December morning when Manhattan was blanketed with the first snow of winter, transforming the city's harsh edges into something that looked almost innocent under its white coating. The official determination was that he had made sufficient progress in his treatment to warrant supervised release, though the real reason for his discharge had more to do with legal maneuvering by expensive attorneys than genuine medical improvement. Dr. Rosencrantz had recommended continued outpatient treatment and regular psychological evaluations, but she had been unable to find concrete evidence that Harry posed an immediate danger to himself or others. His behavior during the final weeks of his confinement had been exemplary. He participated in group therapy sessions, took his prescribed medications without complaint, and demonstrated what appeared to be genuine remorse for the circumstances that had led to Polonius's death. But those closest to him could see that his time in psychiatric care had not diminished his conviction about his father's murder. If anything, the enforced isolation had crystallized his determination to see justice served, making him more focused and potentially more dangerous than he had been during his earlier period of erratic behavior. The madness that had once been partially performed was now tempered by a calculated coldness that made his every action feel deliberate and threatening. Harry's first stop after his release was Ophelia's grave in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, where she had been buried beside her father, in a plot that overlooked the city they had both loved and that had ultimately destroyed them. The cemetery was nearly deserted on that snowy morning, with only a few groundskeepers visible in the distance as Harry stood beside the simple headstone that bore her name and the dates of a life that had been far too brief. He had brought flowers, white roses that seemed to glow against the snow, and he placed them carefully on the grave while speaking words that only the dead could hear. The guilt he felt over Ophelia's suicide was different from the anger that drove his quest for revenge against Claudius. This was a pure, clean pain that cut through all the psychological complexity of his situation and left him face to face with the simple fact that an innocent person had died because of choices he had made. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the headstone, the words creating small clouds of vapor in the cold air. "I'm sorry I couldn't love you the way you deserved, and I'm sorry I let my need for revenge turn me into someone who could hurt you. If there's any way for you to forgive me, I hope you'll find it, because I don't think I'll ever forgive myself." From the cemetery, Harry made his way to the Denmark, which had reopened for business despite the scandals that had surrounded it throughout the autumn. The club looked exactly as it always had from the outside, but he could sense immediately that something fundamental had changed in its atmosphere. The building still pulsed with music and light, still drew crowds of beautiful people seeking transformation through dance, but the innocent magic that his father had created was gone, replaced by something that felt commercial and calculated. Claudius greeted his stepson's return with public displays of familial concern that were carefully crafted for the benefit of staff members and customers, who were watching to see how the Denmark family would handle their internal conflicts. He spoke about Harry's recovery from his breakdown with appropriate medical terminology, emphasizing the importance of supporting family members who were struggling with mental health issues. "Harry has been through a terrible ordeal," Claudius told the assembled staff during a meeting held in the main dining room. "He's received excellent professional care, and he's ready to resume his role in the Denmark's operations. I know everyone here will give him the support and understanding he needs as he continues his recovery." But privately, Claudius was finalizing the arrangements that would ensure Harry's return to the Denmark would be brief and ultimately fatal. The plan he had developed with Laertes required careful timing and meticulous attention to detail, but it offered the elegant solution of eliminating both threats to his position while appearing to be nothing more than a tragic accident. The reconciliation ceremony was scheduled for New Year's Eve, traditionally the Denmark's most spectacular event of the year. The symbolism was perfect. What better way to demonstrate that the family's troubles were behind them than by having Harry and Laertes publicly forgive each other during the city's most important celebration of new beginnings? The fencing match would serve as both entertainment for the club's VIP guests and a dramatic demonstration that the young men's dispute had been resolved through civilized competition rather than continued violence. Laertes threw himself into preparation for the duel with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He practiced for hours each day at a private fencing academy in Midtown, working with instructors who helped him refine techniques that could deliver fatal wounds with surgical precision. His movements became fluid and deadly, each thrust and parry calculated to maximize damage while appearing to be part of a sporting contest. The sword that would serve as his primary weapon was a masterpiece of concealed lethality. To casual observation, it appeared to be a standard fencing foil with the safety tip that prevented serious injury during competitive matches. But the tip had been secretly modified by a craftsman who specialized in creating weapons for people who needed to kill without appearing to commit murder. A microscopic pin could be activated during the match, transforming the supposedly safe sporting weapon into a device capable of delivering a wound that would be fatal within minutes. Additionally, Claudius had arranged for the modified tip to be coated with a substance derived from curare, a paralytic poison that would ensure even a superficial wound would quickly become lethal. The combination of physical trauma and chemical poisoning would create a situation where medical intervention would be impossible, guaranteeing that Harry would die regardless of how skilled the emergency responders might be. The preparations at the Denmark for New Year's Eve took on a surreal quality, as staff members worked to create a celebration that would serve as both party and funeral. The main dance floor was configured to accommodate both dancing and the fencing match, with special lighting that would ensure every moment of the contest would be visible to the assembled guests. A raised platform was constructed to serve as the dueling area, surrounded by seating that would allow VIP customers to watch the match as if it were gladiatorial combat in a Roman arena. Harry appeared to be oblivious to the murderous intentions behind the reconciliation ceremony, accepting Claudius's explanations about the importance of publicly demonstrating that the family's troubles had been resolved. He agreed to participate in the fencing match with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm, even spending time practicing his techniques with instructors who had no idea they were helping to prepare a man for his own execution. But those who looked closely could see that Harry's compliance masked an awareness of the danger he was facing. His movements had acquired a predatory quality that suggested he understood exactly what kind of contest he was preparing for, and his conversations with staff members often included subtle references to finality and conclusion that suggested he knew his time at the Denmark was coming to an end. Gertrude watched these preparations with growing unease, sensing undercurrents in her family's interactions that she couldn't fully identify but that filled her with foreboding. The woman who had once moved through the Denmark like a queen surveying her domain now felt like a prisoner in a palace where every smile concealed malicious intent and every friendly gesture might be the prelude to betrayal. She had begun to suspect that Harry's accusations about Claudius might have contained more truth than she had been willing to acknowledge, but the realization came too late for her to change the course of events that had been set in motion by her husband's manipulations. She was trapped between loyalty to her current husband and growing doubt about the circumstances that had made their marriage possible. The final week before New Year's Eve brought with it a sense of inevitable doom that seemed to permeate every corner of the Denmark. Staff members went about their duties with mechanical efficiency, but conversations were muted and laughter felt forced. Even the customers seemed to sense that something was wrong, though they couldn't identify what had changed in the club's atmosphere. Harry spent those final days making what appeared to be casual visits to various locations throughout the building, but which were actually final farewells to places that had defined his childhood and young adulthood. He stood for long minutes in his father's old office, now completely redecorated to reflect Claudius's different tastes. He visited the rooftop terrace where Ophelia had died, placing fresh flowers beside the fountain that had become her tomb. He walked through the main dance floor during the quiet afternoon hours, remembering nights when the space had pulsed with the innocent joy that his father had created. As December 31st dawned clear and cold over Manhattan, Harry Denmark prepared for what he knew would be either the culmination of his quest for justice or the end of his own life. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would settle all debts and answer all questions, transforming the Denmark's dance floor into a battlefield where the ghosts of the past would finally find peace or claim new victims to accompany them into the darkness. New Year's Eve 1977 arrived in Manhattan, with all the desperate energy of a city trying to dance away the memories of a year that had brought blackouts, financial crisis, and social upheaval that had shaken the foundations of everything New Yorkers thought they knew about their world. The Denmark opened its doors that evening for what would prove to be the final celebration in its history, though none of the glittering guests who passed through the velvet ropes could have imagined they were attending a funeral disguised as a party. The club had been transformed into something that transcended its usual role as a nightclub, becoming instead a stage set for a drama whose final act would be written in blood on the polished dance floor, where thousands had once found joy and transformation. Every surface gleamed with additional lighting that had been installed specifically for the evening's festivities, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously more brilliant and more ominous than anything that Denmark had ever presented to its customers. The guest list represented the absolute pinnacle of New York's social hierarchy, everyone who mattered, in the worlds of entertainment, politics, fashion, and finance gathering in one location for what the newspapers had described as the most exclusive New Year's Eve party in the city's history. They came dressed in their finest disco-era finery, the men wearing perfectly tailored suits with wide lapels and silk shirts unbuttoned to reveal gold chains. The women flowing through the space in gowns that caught the light from the mirror balls and transformed them into living sculptures of sequined elegance. But beneath the surface glamour, those with the sensitivity to perceive such things could detect currents of tension that had nothing to do with the usual social dynamics of competition and display. There was something predatory in the way certain guests watched Harry Denmark move through the crowd, something calculating in their assessment of his interactions with his stepfather and the young man who would serve as his opponent in the evening's featured entertainment. Claudius moved through the party with the confidence of a man whose victory was assured, greeting VIP guests with the perfect combination of warmth and authority that had made him successful in business and deadly in family politics. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that emphasized his physical presence while projecting an image of sophisticated power, and his conversations were peppered with references to new business opportunities and expansion plans that suggested that Denmark's future under his leadership would be even more profitable than its legendary past. Gertrude, radiant in a flowing silver gown that made her appear to be made of liquid starlight, served as the perfect hostess for an event that would celebrate both the passing of an old year and the beginning of what her husband promised would be a new era of prosperity and stability. But those who knew her well could detect something brittle in her smile, a quality that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will while privately battling doubts and fears that she couldn't openly acknowledge. The evening's entertainment had been planned with meticulous attention to both spectacular presentation and psychological manipulation. The fencing match between Harry and Laertes was scheduled to take place at the stroke of midnight, symbolically marking the transition between past and future while providing a dramatic climax to the party that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it, assuming any of them survived to tell the story. The dueling platform had been constructed in the center of the main dance floor, raised high enough that every guest would have a clear view of the contest, while remaining low enough that the participants could feel the energy and attention of the surrounding crowd. The lighting system had been programmed to create dramatic effects that would enhance the visual impact of the swordplay, with spots that would follow the combatants' movements and colored filters that would make their blades appear to flash with supernatural fire. Harry spent the early hours of the party in conversations that felt like final farewells, though he was careful not to reveal the depth of his awareness about what the evening would bring. He spoke with staff members who had known him since childhood, thanking them for their loyalty to his family and expressing hope that they would find good employment elsewhere when the Denmark inevitably closed following the night's events. His conversation with the head bartender, a man named Giuseppe who had served drinks to 3 generations of celebrities and socialites, carried particular poignancy as they discussed the changes that had transformed the nightclub industry over the past decade. "The magic is going out of places like this," Giuseppe observed, while polishing glasses with the automatic precision that came from 30 years of professional practice. "Everything is becoming corporate now, More about making money than making people happy. Your father understood the difference, but I don't know if anyone else does anymore." Harry nodded thoughtfully, understanding that Giuseppe was describing something larger than just the evolution of nightclub culture. The entire disco era was beginning to show signs of commercialization and exhaustion that suggested its revolutionary energy was being systematically destroyed by the same forces that had once embraced it as a source of profit and cultural influence. As the evening progressed toward its deadly climax, the party reached levels of intensity that pushed even the Denmark's legendary capacity for spectacular entertainment. The dance floor writhed with bodies moving to the hypnotic rhythms of extended disco mixes that seemed designed to induce trance-like states in anyone who surrendered to their relentless 4/4 beat. The cocaine flowed as freely as the champagne, creating an atmosphere of artificial euphoria that masked the undercurrents of violence and betrayal that were about to erupt into the open. Laertes spent these final hours in focused preparation, warming up his muscles and reviewing the techniques that would transform what appeared to be a sporting contest into an execution. He had consumed enough alcohol to appear relaxed and celebratory, but not enough to impair his reflexes or coordination. Every movement of his body was calculated to project confidence while concealing the modifications that had been made to his weapon and his intentions. The sword he would wield in the duel had been inspected by neutral parties and pronounced safe for competitive fencing, but the inspection had been conducted by people who were either incompetent or who had been persuaded to overlook the subtle alterations that made the weapon deadly. The poison tip was invisible to casual examination, and the release mechanism that would activate it during the match was so small and precisely engineered that even an expert would have difficulty detecting it without specialized equipment. At 11:30, as midnight approached with the inexorability of fate itself, Claudius called for the attention of all the assembled guests. His voice carrying through the Denmark's sophisticated sound system with clarity that ensured no one would miss the words that would set the final tragedy in motion. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends and family," he began, his tone carrying exactly the right combination of celebration and solemnity. "Tonight marks not just the end of one year and the beginning of another, but also the resolution of a family conflict that has caused all of us considerable pain and concern. My stepson Harry and young Laertes have agreed to settle their differences through honorable combat, demonstrating that even the deepest wounds can be healed through courage and mutual respect." The applause that greeted this announcement was enthusiastic but carried undertones that suggested at least some of the guests understood they were about to witness something more significant than a friendly sporting match. The crowd began to arrange itself around the dueling platform, with the most important spectators claiming positions that would give them the best view of what was about to unfold. As the final minutes before midnight ticked away, Harry and Laertes took their positions on opposite sides of the raised platform, each holding weapons that appeared identical but carried vastly different potentials for destruction. The lighting dimmed throughout the rest of the club, while intensifying on the dueling area, creating a theatrical environment that transformed the two young men into gladiators performing for the entertainment of a decadent aristocracy. The countdown to midnight began with the assembled crowd chanting in unison, their voices creating a rhythmic backdrop that transformed the Denmark's main floor into something resembling an ancient coliseum, where life and death entertainment was presented for the pleasure of the wealthy and powerful. As the final seconds ticked away, Harry and Laertes raised their swords in salute, the polished steel catching the theatrical lighting and throwing fragments of reflected brilliance across the faces of spectators who pressed closer to witness what they believed would be a symbolic reconciliation. 10, 9, 8. The crowd's chanting grew louder and more intense, building toward the moment when 1977 would become history, and 1978 would be born in an explosion of champagne corks and celebratory gunfire that would echo across Manhattan's skyline. But for the two young men facing each other on the raised platform, the new year would bring only violence and death disguised as entertainment. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! The duel began as the last echoes of celebration faded into expectant silence, broken only by the whisper of steel through air and the shuffle of feet on the polished platform. Both combatants moved with the fluid grace of trained athletes, their blades engaging and disengaging in patterns that were beautiful to watch and potentially lethal to experience. The crowd settled into fascinated attention, Their earlier euphoria transformed into the focused intensity that humans reserve for witnessing genuine mortal combat. Harry fought with the controlled aggression of a man who had nothing left to lose, his technique polished by months of practice but driven by emotions that made every attack carry the weight of accumulated grief and rage. He moved across the platform, like a dancer interpreting a song of vengeance, his blade seeking openings in Laertes' defense with surgical precision, while his eyes remained fixed on his opponent's face, searching for signs of the guilt and murderous intent that he knew lay beneath the surface of this supposed reconciliation. Laertes, meanwhile, fought with the patience of an executioner who could afford to wait for the perfect moment to deliver his killing stroke. His movements were technically superior to Harry's, refined by hours of recent practice and driven by a hatred that had been carefully cultivated and directed by Claudius's psychological manipulation. But beneath his apparent composure, he was calculating the precise moment when he could activate the hidden mechanism that would transform his sword from sporting weapon to instrument of murder. The match proceeded through its opening phases, with neither combatant gaining a decisive advantage, their blades meeting in showers of sparks that drew gasps of admiration from spectators who interpreted the display as evidence of exceptional skill rather than deadly serious intent. The theatrical lighting created dramatic shadows that made both fighters appear larger than life, their silhouettes dancing across the walls of the club like ancient cave paintings depicting humanity's eternal fascination with violence and death. But as the contest entered its second phase, the artificial equality that had characterized the opening minutes began to shift in ways that revealed the true nature of what was taking place on the platform. Laertes began to press his attack more aggressively, seeking to create opportunities for the poisoned thrust that would end the match and eliminate the threat that Harry represented to Claudius's continued control of the Denmark Empire. The decisive moment came when Harry, committed to an ambitious attack that left him momentarily vulnerable, found himself facing Laertes' blade as it swept toward his chest with lethal precision. He attempted to parry the thrust, but his defensive movement came a fraction of a second too late, allowing the modified tip of his opponent's sword to penetrate his guard and pierce the silk shirt he wore beneath his formal jacket. The wound was shallow, barely more than a scratch that drew only a few drops of blood, but the spectators gasped as if they had witnessed a mortal injury. What they couldn't see was the microscopic release of poison into Harry's bloodstream, a chemical compound that would begin its deadly work within minutes while leaving no immediately visible trace of its presence. Harry felt the sting of the blade's entry, and the strange burning sensation that followed as the curare began to interact with his nervous system. But instead of acknowledging the hit and ending the match according to traditional fencing protocol, he continued to fight with renewed fury, as if the taste of his own blood had awakened something primal and unstoppable in his character. "First blood to Laertes!" Claudius called out from his position beside the platform, his voice carrying false joviality that barely concealed his satisfaction at seeing the first phase of his plan succeed. "Perhaps we should declare the match concluded and allow both fighters to accept the applause they've earned." But Harry was not finished with his opponent or with the evening's revelations. The poison coursing through his veins was beginning to affect his coordination and vision, but it had also stripped away the last of his inhibitions about revealing the truth he had carried since his father's ghost had appeared to him in the fog-shrouded streets months earlier. "Not yet, Uncle," Harry replied, his words carrying clearly through the club's sound system as he continued to circle Laertes on the dueling platform. "This isn't just a friendly match between family friends. This is justice being served for crimes that have been hidden too long." The crowd murmured with confusion and growing excitement as they began to realize they were witnessing something more dramatic than a simple sporting contest. Harry's words carried implications that transformed the evening from entertainment into exposure, promising revelations that would make this New Year's Eve celebration memorable for reasons no one had anticipated. With movements that were becoming increasingly erratic as the poison affected his nervous system, Harry launched a desperate attack that caught Laertes off guard, his blade finding its way past his opponent's defense to inflict a deep cut across the young man's sword arm. But in the confusion of the exchange, their weapons became entangled, and when they separated, each fighter was holding the other's sword. Laertes now found himself armed with an ordinary fencing foil while Harry wielded the poisoned blade that had been intended for his destruction. The irony was lost on most of the spectators, but Claudius understood immediately that his carefully planned execution had just become a much more dangerous and unpredictable situation. The reversal of weapons changed the dynamic of the combat completely. Harry, though weakened by the poison already in his system, now possessed the means to deliver fatal wounds to his opponent, while Laertes found himself armed with a weapon that could inflict pain but not death. The psychological impact of this reversal was as significant as the tactical advantage it provided. "Now we fight with equal weapons," Harry declared, his voice growing hoarse as the paralytic poison began to affect his breathing. "Now we see who deserves to survive this night of justice and revelation." The final phase of the duel was conducted at a pace that neither fighter could sustain for long, their movements becoming increasingly desperate as Harry battled the effects of the poison, while Laertes struggled with the realization that his advantage had been transformed into mortal danger. The crowd watched in fascinated horror as what had begun as entertainment evolved into something that resembled ritual sacrifice more than sporting competition. Harry's fatal thrust came during a moment when both fighters were committed to attacks that left them vulnerable to counterstrokes. His poisoned blade found its way between Laertes' ribs, penetrating deep enough to ensure that the curare coating would enter his opponent's bloodstream in lethal concentration. Laertes' own blade simultaneously struck Harry in the shoulder, but the wound was superficial compared to the damage that had been inflicted by his own weapon. Both combatants staggered backward from the final exchange, their swords clattering to the platform as they realized that the contest had reached its conclusion. Laertes collapsed first, the poison working more quickly in his system due to the depth of his wound, but his final words were clearly audible to everyone in the stunned crowd. "The blade was poisoned," he gasped, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent club, like a confession that could not be retracted. "Claudius planned this. Harry was meant to die, but justice has found us both." The confession that spilled from Laertes' dying lips transformed the Denmark celebration into a horror that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The words "the blade was poisoned and Claudius planned this" cut through the stunned silence like lightning through a dark sky, illuminating truths that had been hidden beneath months of careful manipulation and deadly deception. Harry, though weakening rapidly as the curare spread through his bloodstream, found himself filled with a final surge of energy that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his failing physical form. The poison was shutting down his nervous system with methodical efficiency, but his mind remained crystal clear, focused on the confrontation he had been preparing for since the night his father's ghost had revealed the truth about his murder. "Did you hear that, Uncle?" Harry called out, his voice carrying across the silent club with an authority that commanded attention from every person in the building. "Your assassin just confessed to everyone here that you planned my murder, but he failed, and now the truth you've been hiding is finally going to come out." Claudius, recognizing that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him, attempted to maintain control through the same manipulation techniques that had served him so well throughout his rise to power. He moved toward the platform with apparent concern for his stepson's welfare, his voice carrying false compassion as he addressed the crowd of horrified spectators. "Harry is clearly delirious from his wound," Claudius announced, his tone suggesting rational authority confronting dangerous insanity. "The stress of combat has triggered another episode of the mental illness he's been struggling with since his father's death. We need to get him medical attention immediately." But Harry was not finished with his accusations, and the poison that was killing him had also stripped away any remaining inhibitions about revealing everything he had learned during his months of investigation and supernatural encounter. With movements that were becoming increasingly unsteady, he made his way to the edge of the platform where he could address both Claudius and the assembled crowd directly. "Mental illness?" Harry's laugh was bitter and carried an edge that made listeners flinch. "Is that what you call it when someone discovers that his father was murdered by his own brother? Is that what you call it when someone learns that his mother married her husband's killer within weeks of his death?" The words hit Gertrude like physical blows, each accusation forcing her to confront possibilities she had spent months refusing to consider. She had attributed Harry's strange behavior to grief and psychological instability, but the dying confession from Laertes, and her son's detailed knowledge of events that should have been impossible for him to know, were creating a picture that she could no longer ignore. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. The pieces of a puzzle she had refused to assemble were finally coming together in her mind, revealing a pattern of manipulation and betrayal that made her question every decision she had made since Hamlet Sr.'s death. Harry's final confrontation with his stepfather took place in front of an audience that included the most powerful and influential people in New York's social hierarchy, ensuring that whatever truths were revealed would spread throughout the city within hours. The theatrical lighting that had been installed for the evening's entertainment now illuminated a real-life drama that was more compelling and horrifying than any staged performance could have been. "Tell them, Claudius," Harry demanded, his voice growing weaker but his determination unwavering. "Tell them how you came to my father's office that night with poisoned champagne. Tell them how you arranged his body to make his murder look like a heart attack. Tell them how you seduced my mother before my father's body was even cold." Claudius, realizing that denial was no longer a viable strategy, made a decision that revealed the calculating ruthlessness that had driven all his actions throughout the tragedy. Instead of continuing to protest his innocence, he signaled to security guards who had been strategically positioned throughout the club, men whose loyalty he had purchased with promises of continued employment and substantial bonuses. "Remove Harry from the premises," Claudius ordered, his mask of concerned family member finally slipping to reveal the cold determination beneath. "He's having a complete breakdown, and he's becoming dangerous to himself and everyone else here." But the security guards, many of whom had worked for Hamlet Sr. and had genuine affection for Harry, hesitated to intervene in a situation that was clearly more complex than their employer was admitting. The dying confession from Laertes had planted seeds of doubt about Claudius's version of events, and Harry's specific accusations carried a credibility that was difficult to dismiss as mere delusion. It was during this moment of hesitation that Gertrude made the decision that would determine her own fate in the tragedy that was consuming her family. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, she approached the champagne service that had been prepared for the midnight celebration, her movements carrying the desperate energy of someone seeking escape from an unbearable reality. "If what Harry says is true," she announced to the stunned crowd, her voice carrying clearly through the club's sound system, "then I've been living a lie for months. I've been married to my husband's murderer, and I've betrayed everything that the man I truly loved stood for." The champagne she chose was from the same case that Claudius had prepared for his own celebration of Harry's anticipated death, bottles that had been treated with the same poison that was now coursing through both fighters' bloodstreams. In her desperation to escape the horror of her situation, Gertrude unknowingly selected the means of her own destruction. "Don't drink that!" Harry shouted, recognizing the danger even as his own strength continued to ebb. But his warning came too late. Gertrude had already consumed enough of the poisoned champagne to ensure that she would soon join her son and Laertes in death. The revelation that his wife had just poisoned herself pushed Claudius beyond his remaining capacity for calculated behavior. Recognizing that his entire world was collapsing and that he would soon face criminal charges for multiple murders, he made a final desperate attempt to salvage something from the destruction of his carefully constructed empire. Drawing a pistol that he had carried as insurance against exactly this kind of situation, Claudius pointed the weapon at Harry while addressing the crowd of horrified spectators who were witnessing the complete breakdown of a family and a business dynasty. "None of you understand what it took to build this empire," he declared, his voice carrying the rage and frustration that he had hidden beneath his polished exterior throughout his rise to power. Hamlet Sr. was weak, sentimental, more concerned with being loved than with maximizing profits. "I did what was necessary to ensure the Denmark's survival and growth." But even as he spoke these words of justification, Claudius could see that his audience was beyond persuasion. The poison confession, Harry's detailed accusations, and Gertrude's tragic response had created a narrative that was impossible to counter through rhetoric or manipulation. The truth had finally emerged, and it was destroying everyone it touched. Harry, with the last of his fading strength, launched himself from the platform toward his stepfather, determined to ensure that his father's murderer would not escape justice even if it cost him his own life. The two men crashed into the champagne service, bottles exploding in showers of glass and poison liquid as they struggled for control of the weapon that would determine which of them survived the night's revelations. The gun discharged during their struggle, the sound echoing through the Denmark like thunder in an enclosed space. Both men fell to the floor amid the wreckage of broken glass and spilled champagne, their blood mixing with the poisoned alcohol that had been the instrument of so much death and betrayal. Claudius had been shot through the chest, the bullet piercing his heart, and ensuring that he would survive only long enough to understand that his carefully planned empire had been destroyed by his own ambitions. Harry, though mortally wounded by the poison that continued to shut down his organs, lived long enough to see justice finally served and his father's murder avenged. As police sirens wailed in the distance, announcing the arrival of authorities who would transform the club into a crime scene for the second time in its history, the Denmark's guests fled into the New York night, carrying with them stories of violence and revelation that would become legend in the city's nightlife culture. The building that had once pulsed with joy and transformation fell silent, except for the sound of approaching emergency vehicles and the final gasps of breath from the dying members of a family that had created paradise and destroyed it through their own tragic choices. By dawn on January 1, 1978, the Denmark was empty except for investigators and coroners who worked to piece together the events that had transformed New York's most famous nightclub into a mausoleum. The disco era that had promised endless celebration and liberation had claimed its most prominent casualties, leaving behind only memories of music that had stopped playing and lights that would never shine again. The empire that Hamlet Sr. had built with love and vision died with the last member of his family, its legacy forever tainted by the blood that had been spilled on its dance floor in pursuit of justice and revenge. The mirror balls that had once cast fragments of joy across thousands of dancers now reflected only the harsh fluorescent lights of police photographers documenting the final scene of a tragedy that had consumed everyone it touched. In the end, the Denmark stood as a monument to the price of betrayal and the destructive power of secrets that refused to stay buried. The disco dream had ended in violence and death, leaving behind only silence where there had once been the most beautiful music in the world.